The movie opens with a video being captured by two archaeologists trying to discover an uncharted cave in Pennsylvania. And when they finally thought that they've made a breakthrough, a bunch of these bat-looking creatures start to fly out, and the next thing we see is two of our archaeologists dying. And that pretty much sets the scene for the movie. And our next scene takes us to New Jersey, where we're introduced to our protagonist, the very beautiful Allie. And if you're wondering why the jocks behind her are trying to make funny gestures, that is because Allie happens to be deaf. And since it's high school and everybody's pretty much insecure, if you're somehow different, you are gonna be made fun of. Next we see Allie's dad, who receives a phone call from his wife, telling him that Allie again is being teased at school. And if you're wondering who the tall guy with the construction hat is, that is Glenn, Hugh's best friend slash co-worker. And even though Hugh's daughter Allie happens to be deaf and doesn't really have a lot of friends, she is pretty close to Rob here, who decides to walk her back home. And apparently they're also kind of dating. It's not really anything official. I say this because when she gets home and her mom asks her if it was the same boy and if they've kissed before, Allie just flat out denies it. Later that night, Allie notices a bunch of military helicopters flying by. And that's not the only thing she notices, as she catches her grandma smoking out back. This is a little crazy because her grandma technically has asthma and she's taken a lot of medication and everybody's worried about her, but apparently grandma's a boss and she doesn't give a damn. I also want to give you guys a little backstory into Allie's life. She actually lost her hearing 3 years ago when she had an accident, and that was the very same day where she also lost her grandparents. And much later that night at 3 o'clock in the morning, Allie's mom wakes her up because something is going on. Everybody's scared in the living room watching the TV, and the news is reporting that most of the East Coast is under some kind of attack. Allie and her family's fear begins to deepen when the news starts broadcasting live footage of what's actually going on. And the news team has also somehow figured out that this started in Pennsylvania, and that the epicenter was the cave that those archaeologists uncovered. Everyone is told to stay inside their house, not make any sound, and to also board up their windows and doors. But they didn't really want to stay put, especially because they're in the city and there's a lot of light pollution and noise pollution, and they didn't want to attract whatever it was that was picking off everybody that lived in the East Coast. And so, the family decides to make a run for it, including Glenn, who came over as soon as he heard what was going on the news, and they pack up everything that they might need in their car, and also take a couple of guns, which Glenn brought with him, because in this situation you never know, and they start driving away from the city. Everything around the city seems abandoned and quiet. It's quiet, not because people are not there, but because everybody's trying to stay silent not to attract the creatures. And here there's a scene that demonstrates just how savage people have become when people huddled together in silence on a train, decide to kick out a mother because her infant child was making a lot of noise. Yeah, it's pretty bad. And do we see her and the baby get eaten by the creatures? Not exactly, but we know that they died. Our scene then shifts back to Allie and her family, and she was on her tablet talking to Rob, whose family decided that they're gonna stay indoors. And after a couple hours of driving, when they make a gas stop, some guy with a shotgun tries to take away their car, but Glenn shoots them in the foot and they drive away. This is what happens in an apocalyptic setting, guys. People become savages. Yep. So anyways, they drive throughout the night, and even after the sun came up, they get stuck before they got onto the highway, but Glenn had an idea to drive through the woods and Hugh follows him, and just before Glenn knew it, a bunch of deers were galloping across the street, and Glenn gets into an accident and his car falls off a cliff. He didn't technically die, and Hugh goes down there to see what's going on, but even though he was still alive, they still needed cutters and a bunch of tools to get him out of the car. And since they're in the middle of nowhere, and since the fire department had a lot to handle because, you know, there's an apocalypse going on, Hugh decided to go back where they came from and hopefully find somebody that had cutters. But unfortunately for everyone, the creatures heard the crash and they were flying their way. And Allie's dog was also in the car and he didn't stop screaming, and the creatures start busting up the car to get inside and eat them. And just when I thought that entire family is probably gonna die, Glenn makes the ultimate sacrifice as he's figured out what was going on, and he starts firing his weapon to attract the creatures toward him. And as the creatures made their way to Glenn and started to devour him, Hugh had to make one of the most difficult choices ever and let the dog out of the car because the dog couldn't stop barking. So anyways, after the dog and Glenn died, Hugh steps out of the car and he runs a little experiment. He would throw something far away from himself and he would notice one of the creatures getting attracted to the sound and banging on it to discover if it's something that's alive. And from this, Hugh and the family discover that all of these creatures are actually blind, and the only thing that they use to hunt down their prey way is sound. And this discovery is pretty great for Allie and her family because everyone in her entire family had to learn sign language because Allie went deaf 3 years ago and they don't need to make any sound to communicate. Since it was getting pretty dark and they couldn't drive away because the creatures might hear, they decide to walk away silently and find some shelter. And after it got a bit dark, they would come across this property that was owned by an old lady, but unfortunately, she was not aware of what was going on in the world, and she frantically started making a lot of noise, and she also had a shotgun, and the creatures came and ate her. And as Allie and her family were making their way into the property, Hugh went in first, and as the rest were following, they encounter a rattlesnake and they get attacked by some of the creatures, but Hugh did some quick thinking and turned on the wood chipper, and the very deadly but still blind creatures dove right into it. But even though they all made it out alive, Kelly was bitten on the foot, and her foot got infected almost immediately. So in the morning, Allie and her dad go into town to find some antibiotics. And they get lucky and do find a pharmacy and get what they need, after an encounter with some of the creatures. By the way, they're calling them Vesps, that's the name of the creatures now? Yeah. Anyways, Allie and her dad didn't only encounter the Vesps, they also encountered something a lot more creepier. And yes, I'm referring to the priest that asked them to join his flock. And obviously, this guy seemed really weird, and they refuse and they just go back home. But apparently, this priest is really persistent, and he followed them home. And this time, he wasn't alone, he's also brought his, followers. And you can see that they're fanatics from their faces, because they had this weird look. And when Hugh goes out to, I wouldn't say talk, but communicate with them, the priest again asks him to join them, but Hugh refuses and tells him to just leave them alone. And then one of the most terrifying and intense scenes happens when the priest asks Hugh if the girl, his daughter, Allie, is fertile. And that is when Hugh goes back inside the house and gets his shotgun and tells all of them to leave. And before the priest left, he tells him to shush, and he also opens his mouth and shows him that he actually cut out his own tongue. Ugh. This is the exact opposite of what you want in an apocalypse, a religious fanatic who's gonna cut off his own tongue and probably convince you to do the same. And that very same day, Allie was communicating with Rob and he lost his parents, and he texts her saying that there was a refuge up north and that he was heading there. But heading up north would have to wait, as Allie and her family get a visit from someone really special. When they open the door, they find out that it's a little girl, and she seemed as though she was in shock, and they tried to talk to her, but she didn't say a single word. And in a bit, when they open her mouth, they see that her tongue has been cut out. And from this they discovered that she was actually sent by the priest and his followers, and when they take off her jacket, she was all strapped in what looked like bombs. But it gets worse, it wasn't actually a bunch of bombs, it was a bunch of cell phones set to an alarm, and they all start ringing at the same time. Talk about using an iPhone as a deadly weapon, huh? And as soon as all the phones that were strapped to her start going off, Allie also discovers a phone that was taped to her window, and its alarm also starts to go off. And as you can guess, all the surrounding creatures, the Vesps in the area, start attacking the house intensely. They put most of the phones in water, and as everyone was in silent panic mode trying to get away from the creatures, a bunch of hooded men get inside the house and kidnap Allie. They already attacked her mom, but her grandmother follows them, and she saves Allie by attacking the men, and finally sacrificing herself by screaming as she was amongst the men so that the creatures could come get them all. And Allie's grandma's sacrifice almost went in vain, as more of the attackers show themselves and take Allie with a knife to her throat. And her father, watching this, couldn't really do much at that moment, but as soon as they were leaving, it starts to rain heavily, and there was a huge thunderstorm, and they could now run toward Allie and her captors without being heard by the creatures. And after a very vicious fight with the priest and his followers, Hugh gets stabbed on the side, but they still manage to save Allie. And after a couple of weeks of traveling, Allie and her family make it to the north and find the refuge, and they've now discovered that the creatures can't tolerate the cold, but as the movie wraps up, Allie questions who will evolve first. Will the creatures evolve to tolerate the cold and wipe out humanity? Or will humanity better itself and find a better way to deal with the Vesps? If you want to watch more creepy horror movie recaps, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. We'll see you next time. Bye.